Millions of voters treated as an afterthought, a damning report into this year's Scottish elections.
1,195 rejected papers.
803 rejected papers.
978 rejected papers.
After a record number of spoilt votes, an independent inquiry accuses ministers and others of being too partisan.
We have observed an unfortunate pattern. Almost without exception, the voter was treated as an afterthought.
One of the Prime Minister's closest colleagues is being blamed by opposition parties. Also tonight, the man who led the Cash for Honours inquiry complains he did not get full cooperation.
It's not just me going off on a wild goose chase thinking this is great fun, because it wasn't great fun at all. It was bloody difficult.
2 British children lost their parents, another 2 lost their mother in yesterday's tragedy in Portugal. And 500,000 Californians are moved from their homes as the wildfires spread.
On BBC London, it could be no entry for cars as Olympic bosses unveil transport plans aiming for the greenest ever games. And the damning report criticising the mayor's spending on arts projects.
Good evening. Millions of voters were treated as an afterthought by those who organised this year's elections in Scotland, which resulted in a record number of rejected votes. A highly critical report accuses ministers of overlooking the interests of the electorate. Opposition parties have blamed senior Labour figures, including Douglas Alexander, one of the Prime Minister's closest colleagues, who was Scottish Secretary at the time. BBC Scotland's political editor Brian Taylor has the details.
As the ballot boxes arrived, it looked all right on the night, but it wasn't. Thousands of votes were discounted.
There were 1,195 rejected papers.
803 rejected papers.
978 rejected papers.
And concern grew.
Has there been a lot of complaint about the actual way that the elections have been carried out?
Tens of thousands of votes across Scotland have been discounted this evening. That is totally unacceptable in a democratic society.
Today's report accuses ministers of neglecting the voters and thinking instead of their own political advantage when they change the election system. It says the Scotland Office and Scottish Executive frequently focused on partisan political interests, and that changes were introduced with the expectation they would fall into place.
In considering the circumstances surrounding the planning, organisation and implementation of the May 3rd elections in Scotland, we have observed an unfortunate pattern. Almost without exception, the voter was treated as an afterthought.
For the Scottish Parliament, you mark the people or parties you want to vote for with an X.
Council elections were held on the same day as the Scottish Parliament, and the 2 votes required for the Holyrood contest were squeezed onto a single ballot paper. Today's report says that was the biggest factor confusing the voters. As the Scottish Secretary at the time, Douglas Alexander, who's Labour's election coordinator, was responsible for the Holyrood ballot, and his opponents say he's to blame.
It's an absolute scandal, isn't it? I mean, here we have an independent report that says the Labour government put its own party interests above the interests of voters in holding general elections. This is normally the kind of thing we criticise other countries for.
But the government points out today's report doesn't just criticise ministers.
While clearly there are lessons to be learned and changes to be made, I do agree with Mr Gould when he says on the final page of his report that it's important not to lose sight of the many positive aspects and good intentions of those involved.
The report also criticises the SNP. Instead of just their party name, they spelled out Alex Salmond for First Minister on the Holyrood ballot paper. But Mr Salmond says Westminster got it wrong and should relinquish control.
The then Secretary of State for Scotland, Douglas Alexander, should be making some sort of statement, some sort of apology, some sort of acknowledgement that this report alleges that he made decisions for partisan reasons and then made a total mess of running the elections.
Today's report says there should be a single body in charge of elections to Holyrood and also to Scotland's councils. It says the logical choice for that single body is the Scottish Parliament. This is shaping up into another political row between Scotland and London. Brian Taylor, BBC News, inside the Scottish Parliament.